Okay, I think we can get started. Hello everyone again. Thank you for joining us. Good morning to you. Good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. So today we'll be discussing recovery readiness for Entra ID, and just to see, if you're actually prepared for, recovery of Entra ID today, right? So, uh, for those of you who do not know much about us, and I'm sure most of you today who are joining us know something about Haiku, but just a very quick overview for those of you who do not know much about us. We are the number one SaaS data protection platform. We are backed by some of the likes Bain Capital, Acru, Cisco Investments, Okta, and we also have a lot of strategic alliances with Dell, Microsoft, Time Manage, Okta, quite a few different solutions and ISVs who we work closely with to also support backup and recovery for them. And we've got over 4,800 customers across 78 countries. And you can see some of the marquee clients in the logos below. Okay, so let's get started on this. And I'm sure all of you all who have joined today on this session understand the importance of Entra ID, clearly why you are joining this session today. But as you know, as I've highlighted on this slide, losing Entra ID means losing everything downstream. It's a super critical workload. And we've had a lot of discussions and sessions, and I myself do a lot of webinars, discussions around uh, you know, backup and recovery and continuity for so many different solutions, right? Some really heavy duty solutions like I manage, for example, or Box or M365. And then comes the side of IAM, right? And IAM still today, although of course from a data perspective, does not really have even GBs or TBs of data like some of the other workloads. But the criticality of IAM solutions like Entra ID specifically is super high, right? Because the moment Entra ID goes down, and when I say goes down, it could be even a minor data loss, a misconfiguration, or maybe a ransomware attack, or internal threats, or the tenant is not accessible. So it could be so many different things, and anything that happens to that data will mean that the access to your applications, your workflows, authentication, everything is down, right? So that makes IAM and specifically Entra ID, because I believe the adoption of Entra ID is very high, and it makes it super critical to ensure that your operations is going, your users are able to authenticate, your users are able to authenticate to and use their applications, and your entire sort of workflow is working and is active, right? Now, on the right, you can see this very interesting data point where 600 million identity-based attacks happen every day, and this is from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So basically, again, this is not very Entra ID specific, but it just highlights the fact that identity has now become core to the security and the operations of every organization, right? The reason why identity is at the crux of a lot of these cyber attacks is because that is the keys to your entire kingdom, right? Imagine if somebody gets like admin privileges or are able to, as a normal user, get some privileges to be able to make changes in your Entra ID environment. That can have a lot of downstream impact, right? So identity today is the main control plane for most organizations, especially the ones who are heavily on the cloud and on the SaaS side of things, right? So prevention, of course, prevention of these attacks and these cyber attacks is a very, very important thing. The prevention, detection part of it, but recovery is actually what keeps you running, right? So regardless of what happens on the cyber attack side of things, you need to ensure that you're able to bounce back, you're able to recover and get your operations going and resume your day-to-day operations for your users, all your workflows, and etc. Okay, so why is this entire topic more important and more relevant today, right? And of course, IAM has always been important, and I myself have been working on this whole messaging around the importance of IAM, the importance of Entra ID, the importance of recovering Entra ID. But the whole focus on identity resilience is only growing, week after week, month after month, and with so many different changes, so many different things sort of coming into the picture. identity is getting even more important, right? Some of these things which now are sort of making this more prominent and more important are things like ransomware attacks, right? Uh, as I was talking about in the previous slide as well, identity is one of the primary sort of attack vectors, right? And especially for attackers, ransomware is a very, very common thing in organizations. So ransomware, what could happen is that they could encrypt or delete all of your Entra ID data. And we've seen this happen in the past, right? So in these kind of cases, you need to be able to sort of bounce back, recover, have a copy of that data in your control away from or off-site or out of the Microsoft ecosystem that you can actually rely on, right? So the rise in sort of ransomware attacks and insider threats as well is something that is giving identity resilience a lot of prominence today. And the other thing, AI has to be part of every discussion today and is also part of this webinar, bear with me. But AI is an actual risk, AI and non-human identities, right? Because all of these are specifically, basically service accounts or, service principals on Entra ID, right? And now with rising AI agents and a lot of these non-human identities, you basically have way more identities to manage, which means there's higher change rates, more policies to manage, more groups to manage, more applications, and a lot of traffic, a lot of activity happening in your environment, which basically means that the attack radius or the blast radius is much bigger than before because there's so much more happening in Entra than it was happening, let's say, 3 years ago, right? And then we've got things like human error, which I think, as I always say in every webinar that I do, it's something that we have to just live with because human error is something we've seen from very small misconfigurations to we've seen examples like Google Cloud where because of a human error, an entire tenant was deleted or truncated, basically, right? So human error exists; it's there. Whatever we do, we can reduce it. Of course, things have been sort of getting better, but it's going to exist, right? We are going to make mistakes, and these mistakes can be small or can be big. It could be, again, one misconfiguration or deletion of a big chunk of data. And finally, regulatory pressures. So we've got a lot of things across the globe where every organization now needs to think harder about recovery, especially when it comes to data like identity, because that's really, firstly, a lot of sensitive information and data. Secondly, as I said, it is the keys to your kingdom. So it is super, super critical to protect it and to ensure that you can recover that data when required. And Microsoft also agrees with whatever I'm saying here because Microsoft recently released their native recovery capabilities, I think March this year. And there are not many ISVs that you see who release native recovery, right? There are only a handful of them that I can think of right now that have some native recovery capabilities. And this is beyond just trash. We all knew that Enter ID always had a trash, right? But this is beyond that. They've actually taken a step further to specifically solve for recovery because definitely there's a lot of customer demand and organizations are now thinking about recovery because of the reasons that I just discussed, right? But again, even though we do have a good base that Microsoft gives us in the native side of things, there are definitely limitations because recovery is a completely different ball game in its own, right? And we've been in the recovery business for quite some time. We know that it's a very deep subject. You need to think about a lot of different things. So what Microsoft does provide you today is a limited set of objects, as opposed to what HYCU actually provides. We have a very, very, in fact, I think one of the best coverages for Entra ID today. Retention, typically they follow their trash retention policies, which is again around 30 days. In the case of HYCU, it's unlimited. You have storage, which is very important. The recovery and the backups of the data or copies of whatever data they have still sits within the Microsoft ecosystem, which is good, of course, from a native recovery perspective. I don't think they can do anything else apart from that. But the issue here is what if that entire environment itself is down, right? What if you're still relying on that particular ecosystem where your Entra ID sits and your backups also sit, right? So we always recommend, and of course, the whole thing with backup is you need to keep it offsite. You need to take it out of that environment and not put all your eggs in one basket, and be able to take control of your own backups, your own data, and be able to recover it as and when you want, regardless of whether the production system is up or down, right? And finally, we've got from a recovery perspective, of course, everything goes back to the same tenant at this point, but with HYCU, and we will discuss this further in this session as well, but you will be able to do cross-tenant. So if your entire tenant is compromised, you can still recover that data to a fresh tenant and keep your operations going. So point here is with the slide that identity is super important. Recovery readiness is really, really critical, and which is why Microsoft also is emphasizing on recovery by launching their own native recovery solution. Okay, so some of you all may already know this, and for the ones who have who are already protecting Entra ID with HYCU today, a lot of these points are sort of known. But for the ones who do not know much about what we protect or how we protect Entra ID data, this is just a very quick overview of what we provide, right? So the first one is quick granular recovery or restores. So with HYCU, you can restore an entire tenant back to the source or cross tenant, and or you can basically also restore just single items or configurations. In most cases, an entire tenant recovery or restores are not required. It's usually users have been deleted. You want to bring back a user you deleted maybe a couple of months back, which is no longer in the trash. An application got deleted, or some configurations were changed, right? So a lot of changes can happen, which can have again a lot of downstream effects. So you want to bring back or roll back that configuration, and that's what you can do with HYCU. You do not need to restore things in bulk. You can literally drill down to a specific configuration or an item and simply just roll that back within a few minutes. Uh, and as I was mentioning, you have full data ownership, which, and again, most of you know HYCU today, so you know that HYCU's philosophy is that we do not want to keep that data, right? Especially with something as critical as IAM data, we do not want to take ownership of it. It should always belong to the customer. They should always have control over it. They should decide what they want to do with that data, where they want to keep it, and everything should be in their control. So that's what HYCU also provides. Backups on autopilot, everything is policy driven. So just set and forget, and it just keeps running in the background. Ransomware proof, super critical. As I was mentioning again, ransomware is a big, big threat for IAM, right? So with HYCU, you will be able to actually make this data or the backups immutable, which means that even if the attackers get to your backups, and which they do, because now pretty much everyone knows that there is some sort of backup for their critical data, any organization's critical data. So attackers definitely are going to come for that. And when they do, they will not be able to encrypt or delete or make any changes to that backup. So your backup is always safe, reliable, and secure, so you can recover from that. Then you've got data residency and governance, very, very critical with the whole regulatory pressures that are increasing. We want to ensure that customers have complete control over where the data is sitting, which storage provider, which storage tier, which region, everything, right? And again, it aligns with the full ownership and control of the data. We want to ensure that all customers have complete control. And finally, what we do have today is Enter ID and Okta together. And honestly, I've seen this setup very, very often, where a lot of customers, a lot of organizations today use or leverage both together. So we do have a lot of customers, and maybe hopefully also on this call, that use Enter ID and Okta together. So that's one of our advantages with HYCU, that you can manage backups for both of them from the same interface, the same solution. You don't need to juggle between different solutions. And then we've got a few new capabilities that I want to discuss today, for the customers who have already been protecting, and for the ones that have not been as well. Some of these are really interesting and exciting, aspects that you could think about. First thing is the incremental aspect of our backups. So we do incremental forever backups for Enter ID, which means that you can maintain a very low RPO. So you could do hourly backups, so that your delta between your production and your backups are very minimal, right? So with the incremental forever backups, one, of course, is the low RPO. Second is also you are able to manage your storage more efficiently because eventually, as I had mentioned, all of this sits in your storage. So previously, when we launched this solution, this module, we were taking full backups every single time, but now this will all be incremental forever. So we take one full, and everything is just the delta after that. Then we also released granular point-in-time restore. So point-in-time restore essentially is if you want to roll back your data to a certain the exact state that it was at that moment. So you have restore points that HYCU provides depending on your retention policies. You want to go back to the exact state that an object was or a configuration was to let's say whatever a week back. HYCU will be able to do that for you, right? So you can just select that, do a point in time restore. It'll just replace everything that the object is today with what exists in the backup, as opposed to the typical way of restoring. Also, an option with HYCU where you would just merge the objects today. So the object exists as it is, but from the backup, we do compare both of them and we sort of merge the objects or configurations. In this option, if you select this option, you'll pretty much be replacing that. Then we've got end-to-end encryption, a very interesting thing. So today we do support customer managed encryption keys or HYCU managed encryption keys to encrypt your backups while it is being pulled from the source in transit and as it's being stored in your target. And with CMEK or customer managed encryption keys, again, we give more control to you to make sure that you have control over how do you use your keys, the keys are being rotated, and everything's up to your standards in the way you want it in terms of encryptions. Then we've got federated user recovery. So initially, when we launched, we were only recovering the data which was in the Entra directory and created by Entra itself. But now we also recover the data which basically the users which come from the external IDPs, typically AD in this case. So you don't need a full resync. You can just recover or restore that using HYCU, and it just with full fidelity gets restored back to the source. Then some of the other items like exchange attributes and audit logs. So we do also sort of backup and recover audit logs today, along with some custom exchange attributes, because we did have quite a few customers who came back saying there are a few custom attributes we're creating on Entra ID because it's being used in Exchange. So which initially wasn't part of our coverage, but today we do cover that. So any kind of custom attributes that you have which is coming from Exchange will be backed up and can be restored as well. And finally, on the slide, we've got offline recovery. Now, in the case, let's say your entire tenant is down, the service itself is not available, but you still want access to that data, you can come to HYCU and export all of your data. Typically, one use case, of course, is when the tenant is down. The other use case is when you want to have do some sort of audit or investigation. You can actually export some bits of this data, your logs and the objects and configurations at any given point in time. So you can go back again, depending on how long you retain your Entra ID backups with us, but you can go back, let's say a month ago and be like, okay, at this particular point in time, I want to export the state of all the users or the policies that I had, or I just want to extract the log out of it, right? So you can do that from using offline recovery or JSON exports, basically. And the other big piece, which I did refer to a couple of times in this session, is the ability for you to, restore data cross-tenant. So again, in a scenario where your production tenant is down, you're not able to access it, or in the case of actually ransomware, right, where your entire tenant and the data is encrypted or deleted, you're not able to access it, then you will be able to restore or recover the entire backup to a different new fresh tenant. And because again, all of these are immutable, you can safely, restore that to a new tenant because you can be sure that this is not encrypted in any form. There is no sort of, any modifications that were done by anybody. This is a clean backup that you can actually restore from or recover from. So this is again something we released over the past 1 year, in the past 1 year, and is a very, very critical aspect because again, ransomware is a very prominent attack, especially in the IAM space. So being able to stand up a new tenant immediately and be able to restore it to that fresh new tenant is a very important thing that we've seen customers really utilize with us. Now, the other piece with now that we've sort of understood what readiness per se looks like, especially with Haiku, right from automated backups to the ability to restore to a fresh new tenant altogether, or the encryption part of it, so many different things. The other piece that we do also offer to customers and have as a free tool as part of the R-Cloud, HYCU R-Cloud, is the HYCU R-Graph. And what we do here with R-Graph is it's not exactly the same protecting your Entra ID data, but what we do is we leverage your Entra ID configuration or your connection to discover and help you identify the unprotected applications or workloads. So in this example, just as a flow, you can see you connect your Entra ID with us. We map out all the different applications and workloads you have in your ecosystem. We categorize them into different buckets like infrastructure, DevOps, ITSM, HR, finance, etc. And then we list all of these different workloads, and you will be able to see the ones that are not being protected. And in this example, you can see GitHub, right? So GitHub is a very, very critical workload. It holds a massive amount of IP, and you need to ensure that that is being protected, right? So with rgraph, you will be able to quickly visualize and discover or identify the ones that you really want to protect. And the data that is super critical for your organization, like GitHub or any kind of, even Jira for that matter, or M365, right? Anything that's not being protected. And we've seen specifically this being used in cases where there's a lot of shadow SaaS or shadow apps that are being used, right? Of course, there are so many different applications. Sometimes some of them slip through the cracks. So rgraph helps IT teams or backup admins to actually get that entire visualization and that entire understanding of what's out there, what's being protected, not being protected, what should I start protecting from today. And because Haiku has a very, very wide coverage, which I'll also cover in the next slide, you can actually just start your protection journey with Haiku itself. Take GitHub for an example. You can just identify that, oh, that's something that I do want to protect from today. You can just start doing that with Haiku as well, right? And on that note, as I was mentioning, it's not just Entra ID, it's not just Okta or the IAM part of things. Haiku has literally the widest coverage, and I'm sure most of you, or all of you, hopefully on this call, know about this. That we've got a very, very wide coverage, right? So right from hybrid cloud infrastructure, which could include your VMware, your Nutanix, etc., to your cloud and cloud applications, to a lot of different SaaS solutions today. And we have actually the widest coverage, and we are also, recognized as the leader in SaaS data protection. And with that, I will, we've got a QR code here for anybody who wants to scan and take the product tour, or you could, also book time with your Haiku representative to get started on your recovery journey. But with this, at this point, I'm just going to sort of sum things up. We spoke about, why identity resilience is becoming more prominent and more important, and the fact that Microsoft also is thinking along those lines, because I think everybody is recognizing that identity data has to be protected and it has to be, recoverable. And we went through what we offer today, some of the new updates we've had over the last 1 year, and how you can, sort of leverage all of these different capabilities with us, and also go beyond Entra ID with our graph, visualizing things and protecting over 100 different workloads with us. So I'm going to take a quick pause here, and we do have a poll question, so please do feel free to answer to that. And at this point, I will also, encourage people to post any questions you have in the Q&A section so I can, address them. Okay, so I think we do have one question here. So that is, yeah, how frequently we can take backups of Entra ID data? So that's a good question. So again, I'm assuming, a lot of us on this session know that we have this whole policies on Haiku, which will allow you to make the whole backup and recovery backup piece very flexible, which means that you can control your frequency, your attention, your targets, your replication policies, all of it in a single policy, right? And which basically means that you have total freedom and control over how frequently you want to back it up. We don't have a set cadence or a set frequency that we have. It's completely up to you. You want to do it once a day, you want to do it once every hour, or once a week, whatever that is. It's totally up to you. So the frequency part is completely in your hands. And then we also have, what are the different storage options available? Okay, perfect. So yeah, and so, coming back to the fact that the customer, IQ basically allows you to bring your own storage, which means that you can use your AWS, GCP, Azure. You can use something like Wasabi or any S3 compatible storage. We are also working on capabilities to help you bring this data back on-prem. Now, Entra ID data, of course, is not very large. These are just configurations and data. It's like users and objects basically. So it's not going to be very, very big, but there are organizations who will still prefer bringing it back on-prem. That will also be something that you will be able to do, shortly. We are working on some capabilities around that. But apart from that, today, any S3 compatible storage, you can decide the region, the storage tier, everything. Everything's completely up to you, right? You just come here and configure your targets onto Haiku, and you can just keep all your backups up there. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. I hope this session was insightful, and I hope it sort of got you thinking in terms of your recovery readiness and preparedness for Enter ID. It's a very, very, very critical workload. It literally holds the keys to your entire kingdom. And again, stressing on the same point that identity resilience is now becoming really critical with everything that's happening around us from an AI perspective, cyber attacks perspective. So it's a great point for us to take a pause and think about how ready we are in terms of our resilience for identity protection, identity data, and how we want to take this further on that. So thank you so much for attending, guys, and I hope that again this was insightful. Have a great day. Thank you.